Okay, so we're going to talk about the second of the 4 types of factoring. And remember what factoring is. You should always sort of have it in the back of your mind what it is. It's going backwards from multiplication. Okay? It's taking some answer and figuring out what times what gives you that answer. So like I said before when we first started this, like if you factor 24, you're trying to find 2 numbers that multiply to get 24. So 6 times 4, you factored it. But we're using algebraic expressions. And the first type of factoring that we learned was called, what did I call it? No. Really? No one? G, or for short, GCF factoring. Okay? It helps if you name them. So the first type we learned was GCF factoring. This type that we're going to learn is called x squared, because that's what the answer begins with that we're factoring, trinomial, because there's 3 terms. So we're going to call it x squared trinomial factoring. Before we do the actual factoring, let's do some multiplying, which we did last year. Okay? How do you multiply a binomial by a binomial? How many multiplications are you going to do? 4, right? You're going to take every term in the first binomial and multiply it by every term in the second. So x times x is x squared. X times positive 2 is plus 2x. Minus 4 times x is minus 4x. And minus 4 times plus 2 is minus 8. And with all algebraic expressions, you should simplify as much as you can. I can combine these x's in the middle to make negative 2x. Similarly, for multiplications. So b squared minus 3b minus 8b plus 24. Watch your signs. Which gives us, when we collect the 2 in the middle, minus 11b plus 24. So you guys know how to take 2 binomials, multiply them through, simplify, and get a trinomial. Okay, remember, you should know what I mean when I'm saying binomial and trinomial. If you don't, you got to ask. So the factoring is, we're going from the answer back to figuring out what we have to multiply. That's what we're doing. Okay? So we multiply the 2 binomials to get the answer, but then we factor the answer to get back to figure out what we multiplied by. Okay? So when we have a trinomial, it's always going to be 2 binomials that multiply together. Okay? Oh, sorry. I forgot about this. A little practice first. This is going to help you with the factoring. Okay? Is just sort of being comfortable with figuring out 2 numbers, positive or negative, or both positive, right? That multiply to get something and add to get something. So what 2 numbers multiply to get 15 and add to get 8? 8 and 5? 3 and 5. Good. What about 2 numbers that multiply to get 18, but add to get negative 9? Sorry? Negative 6 and negative 3, right? Remember, we can get a positive product By multiplying two positives together or two negatives together? Two numbers that add to 2 but multiply to get -8. Well, if they multiply to get -8, one must be positive and the other must be negative. What do we got? 2 and -4, I heard? That's correct. Two numbers that multiply to get -10 but add to get -3. So think of two numbers, like, don't think of numbers that add to these. Think of numbers that multiply first and then check to see if they add. So think of two numbers that multiply to get to -10. So 2 and 5, but one of them has to be negative, right? So is it -5 and 2 or 5 and -2? -5 and 2. Two numbers that add to -7 multiply to get 12. The hint here, if they add to get a negative and multiply to get a positive, they're both going to be negative. What do you think? -4 and -3. Two numbers that add to -5 multiply to -14. So I'm thinking numbers that multiply to get 14, 14 and 1, 7 and 2. One of them has to be negative. -7 and -2. -7 and +2. Because if they're both negative, it would give us a positive product, which we're not looking for in this case. Product of -30, sum of 1. So think of numbers that multiply to get 30. One of them has to be negative to get -30. -6 and 5 or 6 and -5? Because it has to be positive when we add them. Add to get 0, multiply to get -16. -4 and +4. Multiply to get 40, add to get 14. 4 and 10, both positive. And finally, add to get -6, multiply to get -7. -7 and +1. Knowing how to do these will help you do the factoring, and you'll see why in a second. Okay? So let's go from multiplying to the answer. So we know how to do this. We do 4 multiplications. So we get x squared plus 4x plus 3x plus 12. Simplify the 2 in the middle to get x squared plus 7x plus 12. What does the answer, like when we multiply these binomials, what does the answer, what's the first term of the answer all the time? X squared or a squared or b squared or whatever the variable is, right? And then there's some number, x, and then there's some number, okay? So if we go backwards, if we're going from x squared at 7 plus 7x plus 12, I know it's going to be 2 binomials multiplied, right? I know the first term in each one is going to be x and x because x times x gives me x squared. The question is, how would I know the numbers to put in? What do you notice about these numbers compared to the ones here? Notice anything? So 3 and 4, whoops, 3 and 4, the two numbers I'm looking for, add to get the number in the middle, and they multiply to get the number at the end. That's how we figure them out. So we get plus 4 plus 3. Tell me something. Would this answer also be correct? Yes, right? Because when we multiply, the order doesn't matter. 2 times 3 is still the same as 3 times 2. Okay? So one of them doesn't have to go before the other. You just have to make sure you have the correct numbers. So that's how we factor these x squared trinomials. So here, when I see these, first thing I'm going to do is say, okay, I know the two that I'm multiplying are going to be binomials. I know that. I know the first two terms must be x and x. It's the numbers I need to figure out. Well, the numbers that I'm looking for have to have a sum of positive 5 and a product of positive 4. That's why I gave you those practice questions on the previous page. What two numbers multiply to get 4 and add to get 5? Both positive, right? Done. You factored it. You figured out what times what gives you x squared plus 5x plus 4. This is called x squared trinomial factoring. So this next one, when you see one like this, automatically 2 sets of parentheses, because it's going to be 2 binomials, and the variable is x, so it's going to be x and x. And in this case, I'm looking for 2 numbers that have a sum of negative 2 and a product of negative 8. What 2 numbers multiply to get negative 8 but add to get negative 2? Negative 4 and positive 2. Or if you wrote positive 2 and negative 4, it's still right. Try the next one. So the first thing we set up, we know that it's going to be 2 binomials that are getting multiplied. In this case, the variable is a, so we write a and a. So that's automatic. We don't have to do any math thinking to set that up. The only math thinking we have to do is figure out, okay, what 2 numbers add to get negative 12, but multiply to get positive 35. Five and 7, negative 5 and negative 7. They both have to be negative, right? In order to add to get negative 12 and multiply to get positive 35. So negative 5 and negative 7. The last one here, again, automatic right away. Now these 2 numbers add to get what? 1, right? If there's no number there, we assume it's 1. And they multiply to get negative 20. What 2 numbers fit that? -4 and +5. Okay. And here's just a little example of problem solving that involves factoring, this last thing here. Okay. We're told that the area of this rectangle is not a number, but it's represented by the expression x squared plus 18x plus 80. I need to find the dimensions of the rectangle, the length and width. Well, the area of a rectangle, how do I find the area of a rectangle? Base times height, or length times width, right? So the area of a rectangle is length times width. Well, I'm told the area is this, x squared plus 18x plus 80. And I need to figure out what times what gives me this. Well, that's factoring. So I need to figure out what times what gives me that. And that will be my length and width. So this is factoring. What goes here in the first two terms, or first term, x and x. And I'm looking for two numbers that add to get positive 18 and multiply to get positive 80. What two numbers fit that? Positive 8 and positive 10. So that means it's going to be x plus 8 times x plus 10, or x plus 10 times x plus 8. Either is correct. Okay, we could call this the length, this the width. We could call this this the length and this the width. It doesn't matter. But we actually have to find the dimensions. Okay. We're told that x is 15. So in order to find the actual numerical dimensions, we just plug 15 into each of these. So 15 plus 8. So that means one of the dimensions is 23 centimeters. And the other dimension would be 25 centimeters. Okay. Does that sort of clear things up for everybody if necessary? Let's go to the boards. I'm going to give you, you know, two types of factoring now. I'm going to give you both. See how we do.